Evening came slowly over the small coastal town in Maine, wrapping itself around the streets like an old blanket, edge by edge, light by light. Street lamps flickered awake, cars whispered along damp asphalt, and even the wind seemed polite, brushing shoulders, then retreating again. At the last stop of the number 7 bus stood an elderly woman in a long camel-colored coat. It was old but carefully kept, the sleeves a little tight, the collar lined with soft wool. Around her neck hung a delicate chain with a small oval pendant she kept touching from time to time, as if to make sure the world was still in one piece. Her name was Alice Rowan. She looked like someone who had lived her whole life by timetables, standing straight, glancing between the schedule sign and the road as though they had a lifelong agreement. But something was off. Her fingers fidgeted slightly, moving invisible things in the air, as if she were searching for a memory that refused to stay still. People passed by, in pairs, in solitude, in screens. The city did what cities do best. It hurried without looking. Alice turned toward the cars several times, but none slowed down. A few passers-by glanced at her, not cruelly, just cautiously, then kept walking. A boy lingered near the corner, holding a cookie and watching the world as if measuring how long it would take to vanish. His name was Miles Grayson, 19, thin, and always in motion. He worked odd delivery jobs, groceries for the elderly, documents between offices too tired to relocate, a few runs for the pharmacy. His world was small but fast, his wallet thinner than his patience. He had one delivery left that night, a small package of vitamins, and the money from it would barely cover another week's rent for his aunt's spare couch. Still, when he saw Alice standing there, something in him stopped. Not his body, his thought. There was something familiar in the way she stood, that quiet confusion, the attempt to look composed while the mind tried to recall a map it once knew. The subtle shake of her head, the sigh between words. Anyone who's ever watched someone get lost on a familiar street would recognize it. The city could keep rushing, but someone had to stop. This time, it was Miles. He didn't speak right away. He shifted his backpack, parked his old bike out of the way, and finally approached, his voice gentle, unhurried, more like a touch than a sound. Alice startled slightly, but her eyes held no fear, only fatigue. She tried to remember her address and gave two that sounded alike, neither correct. Miles noticed the pendant and asked if he could look at it. On the back, engraved in tiny cursive, were a name and an address. E. Rowan, 311 Old Pine Lane. He knew the area. It was far, across the hill where private houses stood like polite strangers in line. Over an hour's ride, even without stops. He did the math quickly. He'd miss the delivery, lose the payment, and might not have rent money. The numbers were clear. But then she looked at him, and all his calculations scattered like leaves. He strapped an extra belt to the back of his bike, folded a scarf under the seat for cushioning, draped his thin jacket around her shoulders, and started to pedal. The ride was slow, not from difficulty, but from intention. Evening folded into gray-blue haze. They passed shuttered stores, a playground filled with echoing swings, and a narrow bridge above black water. At one point, he bought 2 cups of tea from a roadside stand and handed her one first. The steam rose between them like a soft curtain holding the night together. By the time they reached Old Pine Lane, the sky had turned nearly black, and the windows of houses glowed with the color of safety. The gate marked 311 was older than it looked on the map. Peeling paint, ivy, a wrought iron arch. Miles knocked gently and stepped back. The door opened almost instantly, as if someone had been waiting behind it with a hand on the knob. A man in a knit cardigan stood there, worry carved into his face. When he saw Alice, it melted into relief and something like shame, not for her, but for a world that let her stand alone. Miles refused the invitation to come in. He still had a long ride back and a rainstorm forming behind the hills. He scribbled his number on a receipt, told them to call if she ever needed help, and rode away into the dark. The door to his own place was locked. The note taped to it said 3 words: "Rent overdue. Changed." He stood in the rain, then walked to the back of a grocery store where an older man sometimes let him sleep in the storage room. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and the lights from the street painted small rectangles of warmth across the floor. That night, Miles dreamed of the road again, dark sky, no fear. Somewhere in the distance, the pendant shone faintly like a small, stubborn star. The town woke slowly, dots of light in coffee shops, kitchens, and convenience stores. Miles swept the floor of the shop, folded his blanket, and helped Mr. Park unlock the door. Breakfast was a banana, half a toast, and coffee too strong for his thoughts. When the black car stopped outside, it moved so quietly it felt deliberate, like a decision already made. A man in a dark coat stepped out, saying Miles's name as if reading from a story. He explained he'd come on behalf of Mrs. Rowan. She wanted to see him. Not a demand, an invitation, the kind that ends in warmth instead of obligation. By daylight, her house looked different, less grand, more human. The garden was messy in a comforting way. The porch chair slightly tilted, a bowl for a long-gone dog by the steps. Inside, sunlight spread across the floor in calm rectangles. Shelves lined with books, framed photos of laughter that didn't need names. Alice greeted him with the quiet joy of someone who no longer expects surprises, but welcomes them anyway. Her confusion had softened, her eyes clearer. Memory, he realized, sometimes returns the way a cat does, slowly, on its own terms, sitting close, without asking for attention. They sat in the sunny room, drinking tea, the same kind from the roadside stand, only now in porcelain cups. Alice talked more than he did, about gratitude for small things, how streets can change not on maps, but in the mind, how wealth and fear can live in the same house. She never said billionaire. In her version of life, she had simply been in the right place long enough to help others find theirs. When the tea cooled, she handed Miles a piece of paper. Not a contract, not a check. An invitation. It listed a few things: a room he could use for a while, a small stipend for study, a few daily tasks to keep the house steady, and one quiet note at the end. Saturdays are for the library. Sundays are for letters. He read it twice, maybe 3 times. It didn't feel like a job. It felt like permission to exhale. He said yes, not with excitement, but with relief. The first week passed gently.
He learned the rhythm of the house, watering plants slowly, bringing firewood, sorting books by themes, not titles. They wrote grocery lists in 2 columns, one for themselves, one for neighbors. Each day had shape, but not walls. By the second week, Alice shared her long-held idea. She wanted to create something called Porch Light. Not a charity, but a connection, a way to link the young who rush with the old who wait. A local system of kindness, grocery drops, rides home, warm meals, and a phone line where no one would ask too many questions. Miles suggested the name himself. Because, he said, light isn't always a spotlight. Sometimes it's just a lamp that says, "I'm home." They set up a small room in the library, a room of slowness, as Alice called it. There, volunteers learned how to walk beside someone instead of ahead, how to hold an arm without taking control, how to find someone's address without touching their pride. Every instruction card ended with the same line, "Help without hurry." Each night, when Miles came home, the porch light was already on, soft and golden, as if it had never gone out. Porch light grew quietly, not through noise, but through repetition. First, it covered 3 streets, then 5, then a neighborhood. On lampposts, people pinned neat sheets of paper with small instructions: how to contact a volunteer, where to find a porch that stayed lit late into the night. The local library set up a basket of gray scarves. Take one if the evening catches you unprepared. A button appeared on the city's website, "Find your nearest porch light." Miles had never seen something grow so naturally. He rode his bike across the city, checking in on volunteers, tightening bulbs, fixing wobbly benches. The more he gave, the calmer he became. He no longer rushed. He started listening. But light, however warm, always casts a shadow. The first rumors came as whispers on a community forum. What if this is just a PR stunt? Who's really funding them? Why are they collecting addresses? No one accused, but doubt has a strange way of multiplying. And in a town used to looking over its shoulder, it didn't take long for whispers to sound like facts. Then came what Porch Light later called the night of the flicker. It was a rainy Saturday. Alice had stayed in her greenhouse longer than usual, lost in her plants and half-remembered routines. The air smelled of soil and mint. When Miles returned after his deliveries, she was sitting perfectly still in her armchair, calm but far away, her eyes tracing invisible paths in the air. He spoke softly, brought her tea, turned the light warmer, and waited. Memory, he knew, could wander. All you could do was leave the door open for it to return. The next day, he and a therapist from the clinic worked together on what became the new rule book, Anchor Habits. Each anchor tied memory to the senses: the smell of a certain flower, the sound of the kettle, the position of the afternoon light. Even the word home could be rebuilt, one detail at a time. As the volunteers learned this slower rhythm, Porch Light became more than assistance. It became memory, the city's collective one. But not everyone saw it that way. Within weeks, an article appeared in the local newspaper. Who controls the light? Questions around a neighborhood movement. It wasn't cruel, but it was suspicious. Photos of the volunteers appeared online. Anonymous comments followed. Some wondered if Porch Light was collecting data on the elderly. Others claimed it was a social experiment. Miles ignored it at first, but one morning he arrived to find a man outside the hub with a press badge and a list of sharp, polite questions. Who pays the bills? Why an old woman? Is this part of a religious group? Miles answered honestly, but he could see the man's recorder catching only fragments, pieces that, when rearranged, would tell another story. The next day, a headline ran across the paper, "The Shadow Behind the Warm Light." That night, no one came to the hub. The kettle stayed cold. Even the lamp in the window flickered once. Alice didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't fear. It was patience. But what worried her wasn't what people said. It was how quiet Miles had become. He stopped making jokes, stopped talking about ideas, stopped saying we. That was how grief looked when you still had work to do.
Then, one morning, everything changed. On the porch table lay a thin, cream-colored envelope. No return address, just his name, handwritten. Inside was an old newspaper clipping from 1983. The photo showed a young woman in a dark blazer, surrounded by townspeople, rebuilding after a storm. The caption read, "Local businesswoman Alice Rowan funds post-disaster recovery, declines public credit." Below it, written in her familiar steady hand, "Money forgets its owners faster than kindness forgets its witnesses." Miles read it 3 times, then quietly exhaled, that kind of breath that carries both exhaustion and understanding. He realized this was her way of telling him, you can't fight suspicion with explanations. You can only keep the light on. That evening, he unlocked the hub again. And when he did, there was a line outside. Not reporters, not donors. People. A woman with a tray of fresh pies. The local mailman holding a list of addresses where lights needed bulbs replaced. 2 students with handmade signs saying, "This porch is open." One by one, the lights came back on across the town. No press release, no speeches, just small acts repeating themselves until doubt ran out of breath. Winter arrived not with snow, but with hesitation, the kind of cold that seeps in quietly, through cracks in doors, through news headlines, through doubt. The warmth of Porch Light now had to prove itself. Big newspapers began to notice. At first, they called it a miracle of small kindness, then a social experiment, and eventually an unregulated network of personal data collection. Kindness had turned into a case study. Reporters hovered near the hub, snapping photos of volunteers, following Alice when she shopped for groceries. Her porch, once a symbol of comfort, now looked like a target. Miles tried to ignore it, until he couldn't. One morning, a journalist waited outside, holding a recorder and a half-smile that never reached his eyes. He asked about funding, motives, and affiliations. Miles answered every question truthfully, but he knew how truth could sound, different once printed. The headline came 2 days later. "Behind the glow, what we don't know about Porch Light." Volunteers stopped showing up. Neighbors crossed the street instead of waving, and for the first time, the lamp in the window stayed dark. Alice said nothing. Silence was her native language, the kind that doesn't retreat, but listens. But she noticed how Miles stopped whistling, how his steps slowed, how the joy drained from his posture. He no longer looked like the boy who believed light could be enough. That night, he didn't come to the hub. He sat instead by the riverbank, where the reflection of a single streetlight rippled in the dark water. He wondered if all the good he tried to build had been too fragile, or if the world simply tired too quickly of hope. When he returned home the next morning, a cream envelope lay on the table. Inside, that same clipping from 1983, the young Alice in a black coat, surrounded by volunteers clearing storm debris, and beneath it, her handwriting, "We can't control how they see us, only what we do next." Something in him steadied.
That evening, he opened the hub again. The door creaked. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust. And then, footsteps. People came, quietly, but with purpose. A retired baker bringing fresh loaves, the mailman again holding new addresses to add to the porch map. 2 high school kids holding a cardboard sign, "Our porch stays open." No one said much. They just worked, and that was enough. Doubt faded the same way snow melts, slowly, almost unnoticed. By nightfall, the city glowed again, a scatter of yellow lights across the hills, like constellations remade by human hands.
Spring returned, unsure of itself, testing the air like a guest unsure if it's still welcome. But the city had already learned how to live with waiting. Porch Light no longer needed posters or headlines. It had become instinct, a reflex of care. Every street had at least one house that kept its light burning, even during the day. It meant, you can knock, you're not alone. Alice walked her garden every morning. The plants greeted her like familiar names she could still recall. Her memory wasn't perfect, but it was kind. She didn't fear forgetting anymore because forgetting no longer meant disappearing. On the porch table lay a small notebook where people wrote brief notes. "Someone helped me cross the street today. I waited for the bus and found a seat waiting for me. My daughter called. We spoke for the first time in years." The notebook filled quickly. Kindness, it seemed, multiplied faster than fear ever could. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. No name, no return address. Inside, a single line written in careful, uneven script. "The porch light shines through every storm." Alice smiled softly and slipped it into the wooden box where she kept all her letters. The box smelled faintly of thyme and lavender. That evening, Miles turned on the porch light earlier than usual. He stood there for a moment, watching the soft circle of gold spill across the steps, and he thought, maybe this was what real wealth looked like, when your light becomes part of someone else's way home. Outside, the town breathed quietly, glowing from within. And in that stillness, it was clear some things don't need recognition. They just need to keep shining.